Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Grizzly 399, meet the most famous bear in the world, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kurt Johnson. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Kurt. I'm gonna hand things off to you.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you for all of you for attending this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects. I work a lot of different places around the world. I've lived in Africa for 2 years. I lived in Mexico for 2 years. I guide in Alaska, Iceland, Montana, but I live here in Jackson Hole, and have a lot of wildlife stories. But the story that I'm going to share with you today is a very personal one, and it's the story of this amazing grizzly bear that truly changed this ecosystem in so many wonderful ways. And this is just a little bit about me. So you can see me, that's the bear that we're going to be talking about today. As you can see, my background is in wildlife biology, and that's been my whole world, is either studying or working on conservation projects with wildlife, and for the last 15 years or so, guiding wildlife trips around the world, but mostly here in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And so the whole story that we're going to be talking about today is gonna by this chart, this genealogy of this amazing bear. You can see her at the top, that she was born in 1996, so she is currently 24 years old, and she's been given this beautiful, wonderful name of 399. And so a lot of this chart we're going to get to, but just kind of wanted to give you the whole story at a glimpse, and we'll be sort of taking these different years one at a time. And so if we go back, she was born in 2004, and she was born in this remote location that I'm about to show you on Google Maps. And so I'm going to be going 2 times during this presentation back and forth between the PowerPoint presentation and a website for Google Maps. But you can see that in 2004 she was born, or sorry, so 1996 she was born, and then the first we really started knowing much about this amazing bear was that she gave birth to probably her first litter. It could have been her second in 2004, and we don't know much about her. She hung out in this really remote location, and this is where I'm going to try and go to Google Maps. And so there's a few geographical significances that I'll be talking about. So what you're looking at here is Jackson Hole. As you can see, we're right next to Yellowstone National Park up here. This is Jackson Hole. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll be talking about the personal significance of this story in a couple of different ways, how it's impacted myself in a lot of ways and my family. And so just wanted to give you a sense of where I'm talking to you from right now. This is literally where I'm at the moment. And so basically at the very southern end of Jackson Hole. But Togety Pass is this area in between Yellowstone up here, the town of DuBois over here. And this is basically where 399 grew up. And we don't know much about her time in Togety Pass, but that's where she basically learned how to be a grizzly bear. And then something really extraordinary happened in 2006. And this was the first summer that folks like me started spending time with this amazing bear. So it's been this pretty epic journey of over 14 years. But for whatever reason, during the winter of 2006, she gave birth. As many of you probably know, grizzly bears, like polar bears and a bit like black bears, but not exactly, they give birth in their hibernation den, their maternal den, and it's in the state of near hibernation. And so basically, she would have been impregnated in probably June of the previous year. And then bears undergo this process of delayed implantation, or sometimes called embryonic diapause, and basically the cells stop splitting until later in the year. And so throughout the fall and early winter, she would have basically been pregnant, and she basically, during hibernation, she gave birth to 3 tiny little cubs that were helpless. They were probably about 1 to 2 pounds. And then the significant part of the story is that when she emerged from hibernation, she didn't do what grizzly bears typically do. This area, Togety Pass, is a phenomenal place to be a grizzly bear. It's one of the most remote places in the lower 48. It's not in a national park, and not a lot of people go there. And so she decided, for whatever reason, we have some speculations of why, but we don't know exactly why, she decided to take those 3 little cubs and raise them here in northern Grand Teton National Park. And this is an area that you'll hear about frequently if you're looking into the story of 399. There's even a book called The Grizzlies of Pilgrim Creek, which is a book entirely about the story of 399. I'm going to try and go back to the presentation. Okay, hopefully that's still looking good. And so this is the first real part of her story that we know of, is that in 2006 she gave birth to these 3 little cubs. It was just a gift, because if you'd asked me even 2-3 years before we started seeing her in Grand Teton National Park, if you'd asked me where's a good place to see grizzly bears, and I would have told you several places up in Yellowstone. I would have said that sometimes we see them in Grand Teton, but it's not real common that we see them. And that changed. She changed things in 2006 because suddenly we had bears, and she was different than most bears. She was tolerant of people, and as many of you might know, grizzly bears are notorious for being not so tolerant of people. They're a very dangerous animal in general, but she was tolerant of people. She chose to raise these 3 little cubs along the roadsides of Grand Teton National Park. And we didn't see them every day. We didn't see them every week necessarily, but we had the opportunity to see grizzly bears on a regular basis thanks to 399's choice of behavior. And as you can see, these bears are oftentimes given numbers. They're not always given numbers, only if they've been handled by bear biologists. You can see that she was given birth to 3 little cubs, one of which you can see an image of down here, happens to be a big part of this story. And this is Grizzly Bear 610, who was born that first year that we started seeing 399 on a regular basis. And so 399 raised those 3 cubs for 2.5 years. That's typically how long grizzly bears and polar bears stay with their moms, is about 2.5 years. So it's a very long duration. So they have a very low reproductive rate, which is one of the reasons that they end up on the Endangered Species Act. And so if we fast forward to 2011, that ended up being a really, really amazing part of this story, because in 2011, it turned out that she emerged from her hibernation den with 3 little cubs once again. Keep in mind that the average litter size for a grizzly bear is 2. And so the fact that she had 3 consecutively is pretty amazing. And it speaks to the fact that she's an amazing mom. Somewhat by coincidence, that same year, the grizzly bear that I referred to before, 610, also gave birth to her first litter of her life. And it was 2 cubs, you can see there. And there's a bit more to this story that ended up being a really significant part of the story of 399 and 610. Because by this point, 399 was getting a bit of a reputation. She had her own Facebook page. People were starting to actually come come to Jackson Hole with the hopes of seeing this bear. And keep in mind, this was almost 10 years ago. And so she had a reputation for being a bear that you could potentially spend time with in the field. And so she had a small following, including myself and many of us, especially those of us that guide in this area. We had the hopes and expectations of possibly seeing this bear in the field. And that was kind of an amazing year because at the beginning of the summer, not only did we have 399 and her 3 newest cubs, but we also had 610 and her 2 new cubs. And so suddenly, just a few years ago, where we had almost 0 expectations for seeing grizzly bears, we now had expectations for possibly seeing 7 different bears in the area. And it's worth noting that 610 learned how to be a grizzly bear from her amazing mom. And so 610 also became somewhat comfortable with people and didn't mind being near roads and trails and places such as Jackson Lake Lodge. So at this point, the people such as myself, we were watching, hoping to see the bears. And at one point in the month of July of 2011, we noticed that suddenly 399 was missing a cub. And of course, the worst was assumed because the mortality rate of a bear, its first year is something around 50%. And so considering the fact that she had 3 different cubs, we just assumed that one of them had perished due to another bear or just gotten lost or died of starvation. And so the worst was absolutely assumed right up until in the month of July, 610 showed up on our radar, and 610 now had 3 cubs. And so 610 actually adopted the missing cub of 399, which isn't unheard of. Animal adoption does take place every once in a while in nature, not with most species. It happens with wolves, but not many other species. And so even though it was not unprecedented, it was an amazing part of the story, is that suddenly 610 was now raising, for her first time being a mother bear, she was raising 3 cubs, including her half sibling. And probably one of the most significant parts of that whole animal adoption story is that 610 didn't just adopt that extra cub for a week or a month or even a year. 610 adopted that cub for 2.5 years. And this brings me to probably one of my favorite photos that I've ever taken in my life. It's not the best photo, it's walking down a remote road in Grand Teton National Park. It's not necessarily in my top images in my portfolio, but it's still one of my favorite images, because what you're looking at is 610 there on the left, her 2 cubs, and the adopted cub. The last time we saw them, which was in before they went into hibernation, 2 years later in November of 2011. And later in this talk, I'll talk about the personal connection in a couple different ways to myself and my family. But one of the things I love about this picture is that my newborn son, who was born the month before, was with me. And I think Torin is watching with his school. Wilson Elementary School plays a role in this whole story, and that's where he's in school right now. And Torin was just a little over a month-old, and he was with me to see his first of many grizzly bears over the course of his 9-year-old life. So just love this picture for a lot of different reasons. So if we fast forward, a lot of things happened over the years, and I could go into extraordinary depth into all the different things that happened. Sad things happened, wonderful things happened. But one of the things that happened is that 610 became almost as famous as 399, and so many of us were huge fans. If you looked on the back of my computer right now, you'd see I've got stickers of 399 and 610, and so both these bears gained an enormous following by many of us. And so for a couple of years, many of us assumed that 610 had died of natural causes because we just didn't see her. And so if you look at this area here, you can see that it was with extreme excitement that after not seeing 610 for almost 2 years, it was a wonderful thing when she suddenly showed up 2 summers ago in 2019 with 2 tiny little cubs again. And this was literally front page news in the Jackson Hole paper because it was such a big deal. And so this is a photo that I took in 2019 when these cubs are just tiny little cubs whose full-time job is basically just to wrestle with one another. It's just an absolute joy to hang out with these bears. And there's a closer up image of that that moment that we got to see 610 in 2019. And those 2 cubs are still with her. They're hibernating right now. So they will probably leave their mom early next summer, most likely. So we'll fast forward again to 2020. So as everyone knows, in March of 2020, our world changed. And my world of ecotourism changed drastically. Literally, the 2 parks that I call home, Yellowstone and Grand Teton, shut down. And so between mid-March and mid-June, basically Yellowstone prohibited any sort of entry. All guided trips came to a halt, and we basically didn't do any guiding whatsoever. Images like this were taken outside the park because we basically couldn't do anything. And during this time, 399 had left her previous litter, and every spring I'd say it's sort of like it's just this epic waiting game of hoping that 399 basically survives the winter. And we were just hoping that when we got to see 399 that she would be alive. That was our biggest expectation because she is an old bear. She's 24 years old. And we didn't really have any expectations that she would have any more cubs. We were just hoping that we would see her one more season. And so it was a pretty incredible thing when the parks finally opened. Literally, the parks opened. Many of us went into the park just because we hadn't been in the park for months, and maybe with the odd hope of seeing 399. And so it was an amazing thing when we saw not only 399, but she didn't have 1, not 2, not 3, but she had 4 cubs. This was taken later in the season, but I think this is maybe the only image I have that actually shows all 4 cubs and 399. And so this is kind of a completion of that genealogy that shows images that I took. I think this was when the bears were smaller. Again, I couldn't get all of them in one picture. They are pretty active little cubs, and so they were together. But it was just an amazing thing to see that she not only survived the winter, but she has 4 cubs. This is a picture that I took, again, not one for my portfolio necessarily, but shows her very shortly after the parks opened. You can see one of the cubs off on the left. You can see the ears of another cub, and then the other 2 are just bedded down near her. This is a close-up of one of the little cubs back in June. And here I'll continue with the story, and by the end of this presentation, you'll have a sense of what's going on, like basically up to date. but I'm going to take a bit of a tangent and go with a personal perspective, because in several different ways, this bear has ended up having a lot of professional and personal connections. And so I wouldn't normally share a photo like this in a presentation. And I'm sure Torin, if he's watching this right now, is a little bit embarrassed because he was a couple years younger when this photo was taken. But this is a picture of me and my family. That's Jill, my wife, and that's Torin, who's now 9, and our puppy Chloe. And one of the things about, you know, being part of this family is that my son and I, that's Torin, standing on some of our customized vehicles, because he and I do a lot of wolf watching trips just personally. I guide wolf trips and bear trips throughout the year, wildlife trips throughout the year, but he and I also do trips on our own. This is him watching a very famous pack of wolves up in northern Yellowstone. And so he's a wildlife enthusiast. He and I have gone on many different trips, specifically looking for 399. And we actually have never seen him together or seen her together. My wife hadn't seen 399, even though we've all gone out looking for her. And so we've seen a lot of bears, we've seen a lot of wildlife, we've seen a lot of wolves. But until recently, Torin had never seen 399, even though he's heard me talk about her for years and years and years. And so this brings us to November of 2020. We did run Nat Hab trips throughout September, October, and then we tried a new trip in November, which was the Yellowstone Quest, and it was amazing. I refer to Yellowstone Quest as advanced Yellowstone, in that we get into a relatively small geographic area of Yellowstone and explore it very, very thoroughly, which gives us great opportunities. And so in November of this past year, this was my world. This is what I was doing, is taking people out to see wolves. We saw moose, we saw bison, lots of elk, lots of amazing things, again, in our highly customized vehicles. And so this is where I'm going to try and go back to Google Earth, just so you have a sense of where we are. So this is where we left off. This is where our bears typically hang out. These famous bears, including 610. This is the stomping grounds of not only 610 but also 399. And so if we fast forward, you'll get a sense of where I was. I was in the northern end of the ecosystem. The trip begins and ends in Bozeman for these quest trips. And this shows you in relation, I think I can move this around. So there's where we live. And there's the next location that we'll be talking about. And to put it in perspective, this is Pilgrim Creek. That's about 60 miles. And so for a few days, for a couple of weeks, we basically didn't know where 399 was. She'd done a couple of odd things early in the fall, in that she came down. She was actually in the neighborhood of Wilson Elementary, which happens to have the mascot of Grizzlies. And just switch this. And so while I'm up in northern Yellowstone, guiding a Nat Hab trip, I'm hanging out with wolves. Almost every night that I can, I talk with Jill and Torin on the phone, and I'm speaking with them. They're on their way home. They're just a couple of miles from our house, and I hear the absolute worst thing you ever want to hear from your family when they're driving in a car in snowy conditions. And my wife, which you'll hear in this clip, is literally on the phone with me when she captures this video. And you can hear the emotion in Jill's voice. You can hear the emotion in our dog's voice too. And then I think we have my son, who is a photographer, even though he's only 9, he's a very talented photographer. He didn't have his serious SLR camera with him. So this is just a beautiful shot taken with an iPhone or an Android or something. But you can tell it was a really beautiful moment, and it was extraordinary that these famous bears were in my neighborhood, and a little bit bitterly ironic that I was on the other side of the ecosystem, hundreds of miles away, while these bears hung out in this area that they've never been in before, that happens to be literally in our backyard. And this was not incredibly popular of an area for people to be, but this shows how important the story is. This is the front page of our local paper on November 18th, I think the day after that my wife stumbled upon these bears, and literally there was nobody else there. It was just my wife and son watching those bears, not far from our house. But the next day, they were still in the area. This is a picture of them crossing the road. Again, that's one of the wonderful things about these bears, is the fact they're comfortable with people. It's also one of the hazards, is that they're almost too comfortable around cars. You can see one of our next door neighbor in the middle of the road. That's Cindy, basically stopping traffic so that the bears can have a safe haven. And it was pretty cool too that as part of the front page, this is my wife and son that same day photographing and watching the bears. He did get his serious camera out for the moment, and so he got a little bit better pictures as a result of that. But just thought it was amazing that this story literally came into our neighborhood. And so a few days later, there was a photographer from the paper, and so he put one of my son's pictures. You can see he's got photo credit there. That was also in our local paper, and the newspaper didn't do it quite justice. And so this is a picture that's $3.99, not far from where I'm sitting right now, playing with one of her cubs. And I'll show you footage from just a few days ago of what $3.99 looks like now. So she's actually made quite a bit of a transformation from just a few weeks ago to today. And so she's looking wonderful. When I saw her, I don't know if I have any photos because she was pretty far off, but when I saw her I think it was in mid-July, I was actually a little bit worried about her. She didn't look that healthy. She looked kind of skinny, which is understandable because raising 4 cubs on your own is very taxing energetically. So when she showed up in this neck of the woods, it was pretty amazing to see that she looked really, really good. So on a different tangent, and on more of a personal note, when you're in my field as a naturalist guide, wildlife guide, this is what my bookshelves look like. In that, like, my whole world is natural history and getting to know places and getting to know this ecosystem most intimately, but getting to know lots of different places. And so because of my love for field guides, a few years ago, ironically, not far from the time that $3.99 started showing up in Grand Teton National Park, I started thinking about maybe doing a field guide for myself, because this is the area of the first national park in the world. Yellowstone was created in 1872, and is basically the landmark national park for national parks all over the country and all over the world. And so, as you'd imagine, there's phenomenal field guides about the geology, about the wildlife, about the plants, the insects, tracking, waterfalls, geysers. So there's great books about all of those things. But in the early 2000s, I started thinking maybe there'd be a place for a book that would encompass all of these things. And I thought maybe I could be the one to do it. And it was a reach. And at the time, I started doing like weatherproof, just laminated field guides about plants and butterflies, tracks, geology, and wildlife. And I created these things, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to take a deeper dive into all of those subjects and create a book that encompassed all of them? And it was just an idea at the time. And at the time, I just, in a Word document, I threw together this idea. And this is the very first edition, the first rendition of this idea. And so at the time, I just put together a few pages, probably less than 20 pages of just the idea of what would hopefully become a bigger concept, and sent it to publishers throughout the Rocky Mountains, and hoping for a positive response. And the response was overwhelmingly nothing, in that I got no response. The only responses I did get were simply that it was too much content and there's no way anyone's ever going to do a project like that. And I really liked this idea. I stubbornly hung on to this idea because I really thought that it could teach a lot of people, people that I would never meet, about this ecosystem. And so for the next many years, probably 7, 8 years, I mean, doing it part-time because I was employed full-time, I plugged away and worked on it and transitioned from a Word document to a professional layout program called InDesign, taught myself how to use InDesign, and just continually worked on this project, even though I didn't have a publisher, which was kind of scary because that meant that I didn't really know if it would ever see the light of day. But plugged away, and eventually got to a point that I thought it was close to being something that a publisher might be interested in. And so I sent that document and hard copies to the same publishers that I did originally. And this time they could actually see that it had some promise, that there might be something there. And so there was a lot more interest, and I had the opportunity to select a publisher, and so signed the contract, and the publisher basically worked on it for about a year. And then after about a year that they had possession of the book, they basically sent an email saying, I think we're done. We just have one more little important process, which is the cover. So knowing that I'm a photographer, they asked for a bunch of images, and I sent them images of bison, I sent them images of geysers, waterfalls, things that I thought would depict the ecosystem, along with lots of wildlife pictures. And a couple weeks later, it was this really monumental moment in my life when I got an email from the editor, and he basically said, "What do you think?" And I could see there was an attachment. And so, it was one of those moments where I paused, because I knew I was going to be looking at the cover of my book for the first time, and had no idea what it was going to be. And so it was this really powerful moment when I opened the document, and this is what I saw, is a picture of 399 looking back at me. And so this was, for the first few editions of the book, this was the cover of the book. And I just think it's an amazing thing that 399 has this connection with me forever. She's also the model. If you opened up the book and looked at the picture for the grizzly bear section, she is also the model for the grizzly bears. And so the only downside that we found to this cover is that it oftentimes got sectioned with bear books. And it's in the book I wrote is not about bears exclusively. It's about lots of things. It's about birds and tracking and geysers and geology as well. And so after a few years, we did change the cover. So this is what the cover looks like in 2021. But you can see that 399 is still on the cover, which I think is just great. And so that's another, along with my family's first look at 399 a few weeks ago in our neighborhood. This is another really kind of amazing connection that I have with this amazing bear. And so I think what we have next is the only image in this presentation which is not mine, but I wanted to catch you up with what they are looking like now. So after they were in our neighborhood, which, you know, even though I thought it was great that we had grizzly bears in our neighborhood, it was also kind of a scary time because it's not the best thing for grizzly bears to be in the areas, even though we're kind of living in the middle of nowhere out here. You know, there are homes, there's dogs, there's ranches, there's cattle in the summer. It wasn't great that she was here. So it was with a big sigh of relief that 399 took her cubs back into Grand Teton just before the New Year's. And just before the New Year's, someone captured this footage. Hopefully it comes through. And I hope you can hear the people's comments. Look how big she is. She is enormous. She's so much bigger than she was even in November. All right, I don't know what that is. So hopefully you could hear that audio, because I think the beautiful thing about that clip is that if you listen to those people, they were not 399 fanatics such as myself. And there's many of us that are in the park almost every day when she's potentially out. Those were not those people. Those were people that were just in the right place, the right time. They had no idea of the significance of what they saw, because that clip showed her not far from Pilgrim Creek, which is where she's at right now with those 4 little cubs that, as you saw, are not quite so little anymore. The fact that those cubs are as big as they are, I mean, they're probably about half to 2/3 of the size of Mom, which is kind of amazing. But if you listen to what those folks were saying, they had this moment, they had this experience of seeing grizzly bears in the wild, which is something that 399 has given to so many people. Thousands and thousands of people from all over the world have had an experience with a grizzly bear because of her amazing behavior. There's so much more I could say about our bears, our animals here in this area, but I think I'll leave it open to questions if there are any. But yeah, I appreciate that you're interested in hearing about our bears, and I hope you follow the politics surrounding bears in Wyoming and the Rocky Mountains, because they have been considered for delisting, which on one side is a wonderful thing. It'd be a nice thing if they were removed from the endangered species list, and that becomes a complicated conversation, but there are positive attributes to that. But only if the western states, by which I mean Montana, Idaho, and mostly Wyoming, create a plan for management that is sustainable and thinks about bears such as 399 and 610.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. We've got some good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Kurt, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, by far the most popular question is, how can you identify 399 or really any bear out in the wild?
That's a good question. It could be a complicated question, but for example, this summer, it was quite easy to identify 399 because not only does she look distinct, every bear, just like people, does have its distinct characteristics, but there's no other bear for probably hundreds, if not thousands of miles that has 4 cubs. So that made it easy. You know, 610 was identifiable this summer because she had 2-year-old cubs. And then there was another somewhat famous bear that had 1 cub that unfortunately does not seem to have survived the summer. And so, yeah, we look at a lot of things. And she has been collared before with a radio collar, and she has had tags before, but currently I don't think she has any sort of official markings such as that. So yeah, when you spend enough time with bears, you know, again, whether it's black bears, polar bears, or grizzly bears, you do get to know the individuals just based on just their facial profile.
Okay, great. Another really popular question today is just some curiosity as to why these guys aren't hibernating right now, since it seems like there's a lot of footage of them out in the winter.
Yeah, it's a great question. 399 is a little bit notorious for going into hibernation late, and there's a few different reasons for that, but I've seen her as late as, I think, January 3rd. And I think that last clip was the last time she was seen. Now, I think that was December 28th, and she was on her way to her typical area for creating a den. And so I don't think she's been seen since the 28th. But yeah, the viewers are correct in that she is out later than most bears. And then we don't really start to see bears again until mid-March. You can almost set your clock by it because we typically are fortunate to see the first grizzlies in the lower 48, and they're typically up in northern Yellowstone right around March, I'd say between March 10th and 20th. And they're typically the big males that come out first. The females with cubs typically come out as much as a month later.
Okay. A lot of people are curious too about the naming system of these bears, why they're given these numbers and what that means, and also if anyone ever gives them any human nicknames.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, it is chronological, and it's the same sort of numerical system that we give to wolves, and so it's not a coincidence that 399 has a lower number than 610. And so, in other words, you can gauge the relative age of a bear by its number. And so only the bears that have been handled at some point. So a long time ago, before 2006, it turns out that 399 was actually tagged and collared up in Togety Pass. That's when she was given the number, even though at the time nobody could have predicted how famous that number would become. They are sometimes, if they're not given a number, we do give them nicknames. And if you go back to the chart from a few slides ago, you'll see that some of her cubs have been given nicknames. And that chart that I created, and I use, almost every day on trips when I'm talking about 399, I actually sent to the bear biologist in Grand Teton National Park to make sure that I had all the facts that I was pretty sure were right, but I wanted to confirm things. And that was probably her biggest feedback, is that as a biologist, she didn't like the nicknames that those of us enthusiasts have given these bears. They consider that anthropomorphism or Disneyfying, these animals. So biologists don't love those nicknames. And I see myself somewhere in between being a biologist and being a guide. And that's, I mean, if they don't have a number, it's nice to have something to call them. But I can see the biology perspective in not liking those nicknames.
Mm-hmm. All right, there's a lot of questions about dens and how that all takes place. Do they stay in one den? Do they, when they're looking for a den, do they find one that already exists, or do they make new ones? Can you talk a little bit about the denning process?
Yeah, I could talk a lot about the denning process. It's truly one of the more amazing things in the wildlife world is how especially pregnant females den. And the way I think of dens for a pregnant female is I think of them as an extension of the female's womb, because as I said earlier, when the cubs are born, they are very, very small. They're helpless, and they weigh about 1 to 2 pounds. They're in the den for another few months with mom, who's not eating, she's not drinking, she's not going to the bathroom. And yet in this case, these 4 cubs last winter were nursing off of 399 and came out of the den probably weighing between 15 and 20 pounds. So all of that weight, all of that nutrition came from mom, which I think is just extraordinary. In terms of the actual denning process, the notion of Yogi Bear using caves to den is a bit misleading. That's not the way it works, at least out here. So bears, which if you look at a grizzly bear in particular, they've got enormous claws, and those claws are one of the things that makes them some of the best diggers in the animal kingdom. And so bears are good diggers, and so they excavate their own den, and they typically might use the same region, but they don't typically use the same den as previous years. And the logic behind that is that there's going to be a lot of odors associated with past dens, and they don't want to draw attention to themselves, because when they're in the state of torpor or hibernation, they are somewhat helpless, and they don't want to be discovered by other bears or wolves or coyotes or anything else. So they typically excavate a new den every year.
Okay, and do all the cubs den with the mother when she's hibernating?
Yeah. So right now these cubs are probably about almost a year old, because they would have been born last winter in these dens. And right now, all 4 cubs are with 399 in the den. And I'm not saying that because I've seen them all together in the den. That's just how it works.
Okay. A lot of people are wondering what the age span of a typical grizzly is.
She's on the older side. And I think that's one of many reasons that 399 is so popular, is that, I mean, again, it was just this incredible moment when we saw her with 4 cubs at the age of 24. And so, I mean, I would encourage everyone who's interested in the story to stay tuned. Follow NatHub and Wild Things of Wyoming on Facebook if you want the story, because we'll continue the story, because when it comes to April and May of next year, all of us are going to be on pins and needles just hoping to see her again, to see that she survived the winter and hopefully comes out again with these 4 chubby cubs. But she's on the older side of a grizzly bear's lifespan.
Okay. And what age do cubs typically go out on their own?
Typically at 2.5 years. That's the same as polar bears in most areas, and black bears typically leave about 1.5 years. Mm-hmm. So again, it's a very slow reproductive rate.
So quickly before I go on to the next question, someone requested that you put up the family tree again so they could take another look at that. Great.
So this is the latest and greatest. So this has been updated for 2020, and I'm happy to say that all 4 cubs are still alive.
Oh, so great. Okay, so you mentioned something about delisting. Can you explain a little bit about that and I guess what the locals feel about that and any other information you can provide?
Yes, and I'll try and make it succinct because I could go on and on about this. So 2 years ago, the grizzly bears of the Central Rockies, where we are, were considered for delisting. In fact, they actually were delisted from the Endangered Species Act. And it might surprise some of you to hear me say that I'm in favor of delisting, because I'm obviously a huge advocate for predators, for grizzly bears, for wolves. Most of my life is about these things. And at the same time, delisting an animal such as the grizzly bears demonstrates success of the Endangered Species Act. It basically says this very powerful part of legislation works. And so there's a strong purpose for delisting an animal such as a grizzly bear. The problem 2 years ago was that when management returned to the states, because when they're federally protected, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is in charge of managing endangered species. When they're delisted, the management becomes the onus of the states. And so I'm sorry to say that Wyoming, as soon as it was proposed that they were delisted, and they were delisted, Wyoming wanted to immediately start a trophy hunt for grizzly bears. So as much as I'm in favor of delisting, I don't think our bears are ready for a trophy hunt. And there was a strong movement to protest because they actually gave out permits. There was a lottery. And there was a big movement called Shoot 'em with a Camera, which was a nonprofit that was started specifically to protest the trophy hunt of grizzly bears in Wyoming. And it's part of her story is that she actually, like, in order to spread the message of this sort of archaic practice of trophy hunting bears, and I'll point out, I'm not anti-hunting whatsoever. But hunting bears is a little bit different than hunting elk in the Rocky Mountains. But part of the campaign was actually a full-size billboard in Times Squares in downtown Manhattan that showed a picture of 399 and advocating for, protest against the delisting of grizzly bears.
All right, so we've got a couple new questions that came in about the numbering system of bears and the naming system. So I'm just going to combine them. One, why aren't cubs given numbers like this? And two, is the numbering system a national system or is it more regional?
It's definitely regional, and it does require cooperation between the states and in this case, the national parks. And cubs aren't given numbers until they're physically handled by biologists. In other words, they're trapped. In some cases, they're given a collar. Hair samples will be taken. Blood samples will be taken. Weights will be taken. And then they're given a number. Then they'll be officially in the system. If these bears have never been handled by a person, by a biologist, then they can't give them numbers.
Okay. So a couple questions about your book. One, there's looks like a yellow and orange bird on the cover, and someone's curious as to what that is.
Pull that up. I think that would be a western tanager, one of our prettiest birds. Yeah, that's a western tanager.
Okay, great. And people want to know where they can find your field guide.
Oh, that's very nice. Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. And if you want a signed copy, you can purchase it from me directly at wildthingsofwyoming.com.
Great.
Great,
okay.
great gift.
Yeah. Last question I'll give you for today is how much does a mom typically eat in a day? If she's got cubs, what does she require?
How much does she eat?
Yeah.
It varies quite a bit season to season. So right now they're getting no nutritional intake, which is why they hibernate. Hibernation is not temperature driven, which is why polar bears don't hibernate unless they're pregnant. And so I guess the best example of how much they can take in, because they go through this physiological change in the fall called hyperphagia. And so during this time, bears are basically trying to pack on as many calories as possible in preparation for their upcoming torpor or hibernation. And so they'll pack on as many as 25,000 calories a day. Most of that's going to come in the form of berries and vegetation, since both of our bears in this area are very much omnivores. And to put that in perspective, they're eating a lot of berries, because some of our berries of two of our specific shrubs are basically in their most nutritional form in September and October. And so what's worth thinking about in terms of how active they become, because they're much more active during the fall than any other time of year. Like they're out potentially even in the middle of the day, which isn't typical. But one berry from a hawthorn or a service berry is about 1 calorie, and they're trying to put on 20 to 25,000 calories per day.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm going to call it there with questions, Kurt. This was fantastic. I know we had a couple classrooms listening in today, which is fun, and I absolutely loved hearing about 399's story. It's a wonderful story, and I know I'll stay tuned to find out how she's doing after this winter. I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing comments.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again for joining. Shout out to Wilson Elementary. I think a lot of Wilson Elementary might be watching. And thanks to Torin for getting those great pictures and for being a great wildlife buddy out there.
Thank you, Kurt. This is so great. Thanks again. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.